Yes, because Angela was very interested in composition, so if you guys can forgive me, I won't go through it in as much length as I did last time, but I just wanted to whiz through the composition PowerPoint that I was showing you last week. So I'll probably skip the first couple of slides, because it was basically sort of about, well, no, maybe not this one, but it's a tricky one to teach composition, because unlike things like exposure and all the technical aspects of photography, there are no real hard and fast rules, but there are some sort of frequently used guidelines and tricks that you can use to get the something that looks harmonious and pleasing to the eye. So every time you take a photograph with a digital camera, you obviously have a quick look at the screen and see what it looks like, and there's a sort of series of questions, as well as if the exposure's right and the technical stuff in terms of the crop, because when you take a picture you're putting a rectangular frame around the real world, which is not the same as our eyes see. We don't have that sort of solid frame around our field of vision, so we're sort of making something a bit artificial in a way. So the questions that usually sort of flash through my mind subconsciously is what have we got inside the frame? And composition is what do you include in that frame, and also the relationship of the different elements within that frame. Because I could take a picture from this side with you three in the picture, and then if I move around the other side, the order that you'd appear is different, and I'll be looking at the back of your heads and stuff like this. So you'd still be the same subject, but viewed from a different point of view. So by moving, you can actually change the order that the elements are in the photograph. But possibly, what's just as important as that is what do we exclude from the frame? What do we leave out? Because if you take that first picture, there might be something a little bit distracting, just something coming into the corner of the frame, or there might be something irrelevant, or there might be something that's sort of diluting the image. So again, sometimes it's a case, well, I've got what I want, but there's that bit there, and that bit of tree coming in, or someone just walking across the background or something like that. So sometimes it's a question of sort of zooming in a little bit, or slightly changing your viewpoint, or taking a lower or higher angle. If you get the classic one is to photograph someone and have a lamppost coming out of the top of their head. So that might be just a case of doing that. How do we arrange things in our frame, which is what I was just talking about. And again, what does the composition add to the meaning of our photograph? So I've got some samples of photographs. You can have very, very busy frames, like, I'll skip through that one, but I don't know, Angela, if you've seen this photo before. It was taken, I think, about 5 years ago by this guy called Joel Goodman in Manchester, my hometown. And it was shown in quite a lot of the newspapers. It's New Year's Eve, basically, and just this drunken anarchy going on, someone getting arrested and someone else on the ground. And someone realised that actually this shape, this is to do with the Greek sort of design for harmonious composition within a frame. Usually with the Greeks it was to do with the buildings, because they didn't really do two-dimensional art very much. And someone noticed that it exactly obeyed that. I don't think it was an intentional thing that the guy meant to capture that exactly. We obviously thought, yeah, that's quite a good composition, but he didn't have long to take it, because there's people moving continuously. But although it's this sort of scene of drunken anarchy, it actually fits perfectly like this sort of Renaissance paintings and these very carefully arranged elements. It could have almost been posed, although it wasn't. This is sort of quite a complicated thing to start to apply to photographs. So they've, over the years, photographers have come up with a few different sort of general concepts or approaches that work with lots of different sorts of photographs. I hesitate to call them rules, because some of the photographs in these books, for example, might not obey any of those rules, but they're still really good photographs. So they're just sorts of things to bear in mind. Rule of thirds, have you heard of that one, Angela, at all?
I've read about 5 books on it.
Oh, have you?
Something
Right.
I read, just something that sort of...
It's a strange one, because there's no particular reason. Basically, if you've got a strong vertical or horizontal emphasis in your picture, like a tree in a field, or whatever it is, or a figure, it tends to look good. If it's not an exactly symmetric picture, if it's sort of not equal on both sides, it tends to look good to have these vertical or horizontal emphases offset by 1/3 to 2/3. Don't know why, it just looks good. So this is a photograph that I pulled out when I took for one of the stock libraries, and again the top of these cans more or less intersect with the bottom third of that, and the top, that line there intersects with the guy doing the spray painting on the wall, and even that line there almost sort of touches the where the wall joins the pavement. Now you don't have to have all these frames or nodal points aligning with bits in your photograph, but let's say we had a figure standing on the edge of a beach looking out to sea or something like that. Unless you've got him exactly in the middle, if he's going to be off to one side, he or she, it tends to look good to have them arranged 1/3 to 2/3, and that applies whether you're taking photographs portrait format like this one or landscape format. And a lot of cameras have actually got this grid on one of the display settings that you can superimpose on your screen. I don't know if I told you guys that last week. So you know, if you want to check to make sure you've got it just right, you can do that as well. So here's another one which is a bit less obvious maybe, but that's sort of the rule of thirds as well, where this guy's eyes is more or less on the third, and again the join between the sharp bit here and this tapestry that he's working on and the fuzzy bits in the background is nearly on that sort of bottom third of the picture as well. And you know, I took sort of half a dozen photographs of the same thing, but that one seemed to be the best, and then afterwards I realised, oh actually yeah, rule of thirds, you know. I sort of realised it after I took the photograph. So even that one, I mean, it's a fairly symmetric sort of photograph. I think this is the one they used to advertise this course. But again, the top of that hill there and that sort of bit of horizon down there kind of have that thing. The sheep itself, I think I did try doing some left and right pictures of him, or her, I don't know if it's a male sheep or a female sheep, but you know, the trees got in the way a bit, so leave him in the middle, looks good, you know, it's all framed by these trees sort of thing. And again, that wasn't the only photograph I took. I probably took sort of 5 or 6 of the same shot before the sheep got bored and wandered off, you know. Negative space is quite a good one. That first photo I took you by Joel Goodman of the New Year's Eve thing, it's a very busy, cluttered frame, and that's great, there's nothing wrong with that, you know, sometimes that can work really well, but it does give that sense of chaos and people and stuff happening everywhere. Some photographs you can have sort of more or less nothing going on in large portions of the frame, and it still looks good. You know, it's sort of like it makes for a more sort of peaceful sort of image, I suppose. There can be a practical reason for doing it. If this was going in a magazine, they quite often like to have empty space for adding text on top of the photograph, you know. But yeah, having these clouds here, I think if they weren't there, it might just sort of not work quite as well. But just I waited around a little bit until the clouds looked like they're in the right place. But I could have had that photograph, you know, this church tower sort of up here, and that would have been on the third line there. But again, I liked having that space. Difficult to explain exactly why, it just looked good to me. Like everyone's got sort of preferences with composition like everyone else. It might not be your cup of tea, but for me it seemed to work quite well. Here's another one. This is a very sort of classic product photograph, which some of my students took when I was in the studio with them, and you know, again, there's a lot of empty space in that. You can't even see the edge of the frame on that side very well, can you? Again, if I was doing that for a wine catalogue or something, I might take a few shots where I'd put the glass on the left or the right hand side to leave the empty space for text or whatever, and there is room for it there, you know. But again, it's a sort of, these white bits, they're not irrelevant, you know, they kind of concentrate the attention on the main theme of the photograph, I suppose. So yeah, negative space is useful sometimes. Leading lines, which you might have heard of as well, is basically these sorts of lines. In photography we're dealing with single point perspective, which is similar to what we look at, but we are looking with 2 eyes, so we see, you know, things separated 3-dimensionally better than with just the one eye, the one lens of the camera. But the human brain tends to put patterns on reality. We like applying patterns to nature. So this isn't a natural thing. This house has been built with these gardens to almost have these lines in there. So all the edges of the hedges, everything's leaning down towards the front door, even the edges of these pillars. And I thought, well, that's the way this house was built, that's the way I'm going to photograph it. But leading lines aren't always quite as obvious as this. They can even be something like if you've got a whole row of trees, you know, your brain connects up the bottom of the trees into a single line. They don't actually have to be physical lines in the photograph. So this is one without, can you see the screen all right? Sorry.
Yeah.
I'm leaving it on for Sue. Yeah. So this photo here, I might just dim the front lights ever so slightly because you can't see very well, otherwise it's a fairly dark image, that is a sort of kind of curved leading lines on this. You know, if you look at both the edges of the path, the edge of between the grass and the canal bank there, and even these lines over here from the factory, everything's leading around that corner. You can't actually see any daylight around that corner, which sort of gives it, possibly, you might say, a slightly ominous kind of look, because you're wondering what's around that corner, and it's dark. You know, is there someone waiting there to mug you or something like that? Because you can't see any daylight. It's a bridge, you know, so there is daylight there, but we can't see it in that photograph. So it's sort of taking your eye on a path through the photograph. It's taking your eye on a little journey, and you sort of tend to sort of look like this, you know, zigzag like that, and then you kind of start to look at this stuff, you know. So leading lines, I'm sure it's something you already use in your photographs, but they're quite a powerful tool. And again, it's sort of, whatever you think of the photograph, the composition's sort of reasonably harmonious in that one. I've sort of got that branch on the third thing there, which is the only thing in the sky, so better than having it in the middle. Dutch angles, this is something they use quite a lot in movies to convey unease or speed sometimes, like in this photo. So this is one I took, and obviously, you know, we're on this truck and it's travelling at high speed. And I took a few tilted ones because it made you look a bit like you're being banged around in the back of this thing, which is what we were. You know, I did take some straight ones, then I tried an angled one and it looked a lot better. So Dutch angles, you know, you don't always have to go with your frame lined up with the horizon or with the edges of buildings. You can tilt stuff, and sometimes you sometimes find that it works better like that. It just adds a little something that makes it a sort of more interesting image. Or again, if you want to make it look a bit sort of dramatic, I don't know, you know, slightly unsettled, it's uneasy maybe. They use that a lot in the movies, these Dutch angles, you know, especially with things like chase sequences and stuff like that. There's quite a really good film, it's actually, the lighting's amazing throughout the whole thing, but they use a lot of these Dutch angles, called Chungking Express by Hong Kai Wai, I think his name is, the director, set in Hong Kong, and it's about these two policemen, and it's ever such a good film. Yeah, Chungking Express, I recommend it. 90s film. Joel Meyerowitz is quite a famous American street photographer, although this picture was taken in Paris, I believe. Again, I don't know whether it was deliberate that he tilted the frame slightly, but again, it's sort of, it really is absolutely on the point of stuff happening. Cartier-Bresson used to say the decisive moment. It's not staged at all as far as I'm aware, but you've got this guy who's either tripped over or maybe he's drunk, I don't know, and everyone, you know, everyone's looking back towards him. But the slight slant of that, again, adds to this, you know, unbalanced sort of look to the photograph, and the fact you're photographing a sort of accident, one of those little things that happens in the street every day that normally photographers aren't around to see. And that's quite a famous picture of him. But again, you've got leading lines in there as well, you know. To a certain extent, the figure's down here, and you know, the gaze of everybody is pointing towards this chap. I mean, that cyclist is just great. You couldn't have wished for better, just to have him looking over his shoulder like that, and again, the sort of chaos of the streets and rush hour. So, you know, you would have taken thousands of pictures, and probably just some just work. So this is Mike Brodie, whose book's there, and again he uses these tilted angles quite a lot to convey speed. I don't know if that's what he meant when he took the pictures, but they work, you know. He could have taken the edge of this, I think this guy's travelling in this sort of coal wagon or something, you know, presumably across the middle of America. He could have had all the horizons and stuff perfectly straight. I probably would have done that, but it works so much better like that, you know. This sort of slight distortion of reality. You know, these guys have sort of escaped from their normal sort of everyday, and they're kind of outlaws, really. You know, they're highly illegal things that they're doing. That one as well, which is, kids always like that one when I do workshops with kids. You know, if you had to give it a title, it would be like Rebellion or something like that. You know, it's just, yeah, like I say, as far as I know, he never had any sort of lessons in photography. He just seemed to take to it straight away and produce some amazing pictures. Even if they weren't so beautifully composed, they'd still be very interesting photographs, because he's photographing stuff that most people could never do. On a very more formal level, you've got the sort of leading lines thing going on in here to a certain extent, but it's a very clever and I think very carefully arranged composition in, don't know, Salisbury Cathedral or one of the old cathedrals. I think it was taken in the 1920s or 30s, this one. Frederick Evans was a sort of quite a well-known photographer, although he's not very well known now. I mean, this is the photograph that he's most famous for, and its title is A Sea of Stairs. People used to give photographs titles in those days. And again, you know, because they're not, these stairs are so worn, especially the ones up here, it does look like waves, doesn't it? But the way he would have been using a big wooden camera, blanket over the head, tripod, he would have spent some time getting that angle absolutely right. And the clever thing is, although he's got the all these lovely shapes, and it's a very sort of still kind of photograph. I mean, there's a lot of, you know, there's a lot of movement going on in there in terms of all the shapes and stuff, but it's quite a tranquil sort of photograph. But he even went to all the effort of getting all these pillars and the edges of the door perfectly parallel and perfectly vertical, which is something that you can do with those old cameras. It's got something called rising front, which is very difficult to do without one of those cameras. You can do it in post-production, but you know, this is not an accident. He photographed it like that, and it would have been very difficult to get that exact photograph with one of our cameras without lots of digital manipulation or a special lens, a perspective control lens. So this one, I mean, you've got leading lines going on there, you've got negative space. If that was a sort of cloudy sky, or if the dog was jumping over the fence here instead of above the skyline, it would be a kind of quite a dull photograph. Now, I don't know whether Faye Godwin, who took this one, who's quite a famous British landscape photographer, I don't know if she knew that dog was going to jump over the fence, but you know, she just nailed it at exactly the right second. And you quite, you know, I always look at that and think, is he going to catch his foot on that barbed wire there, or is he going to make it? And it's sort of quite a tense photograph, really. So I'm sure, especially if you're a dog lover, you know, sort of, poor thing, is he going to be all right? But yeah, I mean, that's absolutely timed perfectly, and yeah, there's probably a lot of luck involved with that photograph as well. Again, if you look at the wires here, the fact that they're slightly shiny, if they were rusty, they wouldn't show up as white lines. The whole bottom of that picture would just be a black mass. So it wouldn't be a particularly interesting, well, it would still be an interesting photograph, but it wouldn't be such a good photograph as I think it is. You know. And then juxtaposition as well. I mean, this isn't really a thing to do with composition, but it's sort of how two elements interact with each other. I mean, this is quite a famous, other photographers have photographed this street or around this area. It's in Newcastle, I believe, on the don't mean Newcastle. Yeah, I think it was Newcastle, where they used to build the ships, and you've got these terrace roads with this sort of oil tanker which is being constructed. You can see the cranes and everything. And again, little things, you know, obviously it's a photograph that's begging to be taken, but he waited till his kids were there, or he photographed it deliberately when his kids were there, which gives you a sense of overwhelming scale of this ship. And again, I don't know if these cranes were moving, but you know, just the fact that these cranes are all sort of, you know, again, if that was just white sky, yeah, negative space is all right, but I think it's more interesting having the cranes there, and it also tells you what's going on, you know, that ship's being built. It's not just sort of crashed into the end of the street or whatever. But yeah, Chris Killett was very good at composition. I've not got any of his books, unfortunately. I think this is the last one. It's sort of composition, this, but just to show, this is the thing going right back to the first week when I was talking about the distortions that you get with lenses, you know, wide angle and telephoto lenses. There was a lot of photographs like this knocking around, well, that one specifically, during the first COVID lockdown, because there was all this stuff in the newspapers and the press about, you know, these people aren't obeying the rules, they're not socially distancing, what idiots they are and all this. But actually, that was taken with a very long lens on this sort of beach, which crushes perspective front to back, and it makes it look like there's no space between these people, you know, so they can put that newspaper byline on it, you know, scandal in Brighton, people not socially distancing. Whereas in actual fact, if you use a wide-angle lens, you can see there's loads of room between all these people. They are obeying the rules. So the way in which it's photographed is sort of almost making this artificial story without any computer, you know, trickery or anything like that. It's a straight photograph. And this one here, which turned up a couple of years ago, this is Joe Biden, you know, American president, and presumably his wife. And that's Jimmy Carter, the president from the 1970s, who's fairly elderly now, and they're obviously having a visit and they've got someone to photograph it. But the way they've used the wide-angle lens, it looks like they're miniature people, doesn't it? And they're not that small, I don't think. It was just this weird distortion that happens. And again, if you look at Jimmy Carter's feet there, you can see this distortion going on, because his feet look huge compared with his face. And that's what wide-angle lenses do. They make things that are closer to them look exaggeratedly large. But I don't know who took it, if it was a White House photographer or if it was just someone who was given a camera and said, can you take a picture of us with the old president? But it created a lot of amusement, you know, in the photo world. You know, so it was like this sort of miniature people. It's quite funny. Yeah. So we could have a stab at this tonight as well. We did have a play with it last week, but I thought it's a beautiful evening. I think we can go out. We did have a quick go last night, didn't we, with the nighttime stuff, because Natalie was quite interested in that, and we did some quite nice images. If they're still on the cameras, if we've got time later, we can have a quick look. But it was rainy and horrible. Tonight, it's a lot nicer. So I thought we could have a go at using it. And what I thought I'd show you tonight, I'll introduce something new. This isn't something I always do with the 101 course. I normally leave it for the slightly more advanced course, but I thought we could have a go at using the cameras on manual. Okay, if that sounds all right. Because it's a useful thing to be able to do. It does give you certain advantages over using the camera on the stuff that we've been using on so far, you know, program, aperture priority, shutter priority. There's certain things that you can do on manual that you can't do on the automatic settings. But if we can use any of these concepts that I've just been showing you and that I showed you guys last week, bonus. You know, let's think about that. So we will probably be using tripods for most of these photographs. I think it's good practice, and I've got those out for us already. Okay, I'll just put the lights back on. Do you want to get your cameras out, sir? Okay. How's the temperature? Has it gone a bit chilly? Or are you okay? So it's a bit cold.
I've got a bit cold.
I'll knock it off. Yeah, I'll knock the AC off. It was a bit stuffy when I first arrived, so I'll just put it on. But it has dropped in temperature. It'll warm up again quite quickly, I think, and it'll get quieter as well. Yeah. Okay. So manual on the cameras. I think we've all got a similar design of camera in that we've got the sort of knob with all the various modes on. Yeah, you've Nikon, Sony. So they might be slightly different depending on which camera you've got, but they've almost always got the 4 settings, which is MASP, or if you've got a Canon, it's MAV, TVP, but they're the same things. P we've been using a fair bit already. We've been using it program, which is sort of automatic, but it allows us to mess about with stuff like ISO, which you'll remember from the first couple of weeks. And then when we were doing that stuff of me messing about on the scooter, I think we were using shutter priority, weren't we? So we can choose a larger or shorter shutter, and the camera messes about with the aperture to get a photograph that's hopefully not too bright, not too dark. And similarly, we had a play with aperture priority, or at least I showed you some stuff with aperture priority, and we played a bit with it last week, didn't we? We just set up things on the table and photographed them, which again, it's the opposite. You set the aperture, let the camera deal with the shutter speed, so you can change the depth of focus. What manual does, it's the M1. it doesn't necessarily mean manual focus. That's usually set separately. So you can use manual mode, but still have an autofocus camera. You know, and that's I mean, autofocus works very well most of the time, so a lot of people do like that. But the main thing is with manual is that you are uncoupling all the exposure settings on the camera from what the camera thinks you should have. You can set whatever shutter speed and aperture you want, so you can deliberately make photographs that are under or overexposed, or accidentally make photographs that are under or overexposed. Yeah, so I've been teaching the first year's film photography, and they're manual cameras, you know. It's quite funny because you see the films come out and there's a couple that are about right, and then there's one that's much too dark and one that's much too light coming out of the machine, you know. And you say, you didn't change the exposure, and they went somewhere bright to somewhere dark, and they forgot to adjust the exposure to account for this, so they're so used to using the cameras a lot of the time on one of the automatic settings. So I'm just going to go through how to basically use it to start with, and then hopefully during the course of the evening you'll kind of understand why it's useful, not all the time, but some of the time, quite a lot of the time for me, to not rely on the camera for getting the exposure right, to sort of have a bit of input yourself. So if we just wanted to use it in the most basic way, and take a photograph in here, for example, let's change our ISO to something that it's not very bright in here, okay? So let's say 1600 ISO. Do you remember how to do that? Give me a shout if you're not sure. Is that all right with everybody? So 1600 is a fairly high number. That should allow us to take photographs indoors. When we go out, if I forget to tell you, because I'm thinking we're going to have a go at using tripods tonight, weirdly, although it's night photography, we use quite a low ISO, about 100, 200, something like that. Does anyone know why you'd use a low ISO? Because normally you're going somewhere dark, you'd set the ISO to something high, wouldn't you? 1600 or 3200.
Is it something to do with the grain?
Yeah. The lower the ISO, the better quality you tend to get. You don't get noisy pictures. What's the problem if we were to go outside during, you know, after dark and take photographs at, let's say, 200 ISO, when the camera isn't very sensitive to light? What's going to be our problem?
There's nothing going to show up.
Well, it'll take the photo all right, but what tends to happen is that in order to get enough light into the camera to get a picture that's not too dark, you'd have to set a relatively long shutter speed, you know, maybe 1/10 of a second or a 1/8 of a second, which sounds pretty quick, but in photography that's a long shutter speed, and you wobble. You can't help it. Even if you hold really still, it's very difficult to take a perfectly sharp picture at anything longer than about a 1/30th of a second. But if you've got a tripod, it doesn't matter, because it won't wobble because it's fixed to a tripod. Do you see what I mean? So that's why we normally use a lower. It's for quality, like Ben said. Yeah, we by setting a lower ISO, we get a less grainy photo. Now, you know, we could go outside and do night photography at a higher ISO if we didn't own a tripod. That's absolutely fine. Like I say, you tend to get slightly more pixely images. They're not too bad, you know, they're not like it was a few years ago before the digital sensors got really good. But it also gives us the luxury of the fact that we can, if we want to, take long shutter speeds of car tail lights, like the stuff we were doing last week whizzing past.